I think the panel, you can join me, can't you?
Yeah.
Okay,
sure.
while they're joining, how do you feel? Okay, that's what an engaging audience. Yeah, we're fine. Okay, let's do like this now. It's very late. We have 27 minutes for this panel. I'm going to take 1 minute to try to get you back into energy because that's the accountability I have for this panel. So what I'm going to ask you to do is just raise your hands like this and stretch, a little bit like that. And yeah, that's good. And then you're going to do like this. No, we're not going to pray, don't worry. You're going to do like this. And then you look which thumb is above the other thumb. Just look. Then you take a part. You do the same. And you put your hands together and you put the other thumb on top.
Lee, nice to meet you.
Do you feel it feels uncomfortable? Even small changes can be uncomfortable for people. And in these conferences, we are talking about deep decarbonization. We are talking about deep changes in consumption patterns. We are talking about all these shifts that we need to make. And then still, this little thing can be so hard. So this panel now, that's why I have a panel. I'm going to ask them so many questions about accountability. If you were asked, what would you like to discuss just before the drinks, before dinner? How many would choose, I want to talk about accountability? Good. How many people in here feel, I am an accountable person? And that's an honest question now. So how many people feel in here, looking at the agenda and discussions we have here, I feel I'm an accountable person based on the knowledge and insights I have? Raise your hands. Don't be shy. Those that feel that you are accountable. Those that feel, no, I'm not accountable. I'm actually pretty lousy, to be honest. Good. Honesty.
Yes.
So we have an extraordinary panel here. And one thing that we have to do is to cut 3 minutes. And that was my introductory remarks. So I will cut them. That's a good moderator, isn't it? Yes. So I'm turning the page. And I'm moving to the panel instead. We have an extraordinary panel. I will introduce you one by one when I also ask questions. We've heard now the whole afternoon this word coming back, accountability. The question is, what does it mean? In particular, if we are looking now at the new, you could say, global platform agenda that we have. We talk about the successes of last year. We have the SDGs. We have the Paris Agreement. We have many other international agreements in place. But it's a very complex world also. Everything is interconnected, interdependent. We talk about universality. We talk about not leaving anyone behind. And we have also a very complex set of actors, not least the private sector stepping up and also taking responsibilities well beyond what was traditionally the role of the private sector. And cities that we talked about this morning also stepping up. So it's a very complex agenda. Niall Dunne, you are Chief Sustainability Officer of the BT Group. And I should say that if I should start to read the CVs of these people, the 27 minutes will be gone. So I'm not doing that, but please look in your program. I know that Newsweek appointed you, or there was a ranking not long ago, that you were the 3rd greenest company in the world. I saw that you were beating Swisscom by one. That feels nice, I'm sure. So becoming that green company, what is accountability? What does it have to do with it? Is that an important factor for you?
Well, we're a telecommunications company that's becoming an entertainment company, and we're learning an awful lot about what the purpose of the company really means for TV as well as telecommunications. And to answer your question, I think the best way to empower people really with a company like ours or to create accountability, is to empower them. We live in a world, though, where 4 billion people are still offline. So not only do they not have access to all the information that you take for granted, they don't have access to the internet, they don't have access to mobile. And at the current rate of progress, we will get those people online sometime in 2042. So 22 years after the UN said we were going to get all of those people online. Now, I want to hear from anybody watching online or in the room here today, following on Twitter, how many of the SDGs you think we can actually deliver without getting those people online, without creating accountability where more Gunhild Stordalens, more Jamie Olivers can emerge from those 4 billion people? I just don't see how we can do it, and I don't see how we can deliver the SDGs. So for us as a company, we're obsessed with how we can really solve almost with a first mindset. Who are the most disconnected people on the planet? How can we change social norms? How can we work with our customers and partners to provide them with connectivity? And to look at how that can create the type of systems change that the EAT Forum and everybody else stands for.
Yeah, let's put on the Twitter feed so we have that rolling. I think it would be nice to, and please, debate among yourselves or with people sitting on stage here, also those online. But you're saying, okay, there are 4 billion people actually who are disconnected today still. So what can we ask from them in terms of accountability? But how do you make a business model out of that then?
Well, the shared value model is quite interesting, and I think a lot of it does start with the old CSR mindset, even just philanthropy and working with civic society, allocating capital, which you actually have to take a longer term view around when you're actually going to achieve returns. But we connect some of the biggest, we had Paul Polman on earlier today, we connect some of the biggest multinational companies in the world. Every single one of those multinational companies are looking to those people for their medium to long term growth. And as a company that knows how to connect them in Latin America, in Africa, or in Asia, in India alone, we've got 120 million girls, adolescent teenage girls, whose social connectivity is effectively mom, and that's it. They've no relationship with the outside world. So understanding how you can actually connect them, but actually improve their social connectivity by giving them meaningful access to society where they can become basically the consumers of tomorrow, citizens of tomorrow, is the way that I think we can create a shared value model on the back of what would usually be just CSR.
Yeah, you talk about, I think, this purposeful business leadership. Is that part of is it your sort of vision, or is this something you would say is actually part of the company now? And what is the difference, compared to previous leadership?
Yeah, I think the minute that's my vision, I failed. I think the real challenge for entrepreneurs, everybody who's in this room, everybody who's watching online, is a collective vision, is actually achieving shared consciousness. And I think purpose is one of the greatest kind of advents over the last couple of years that has allowed us to break down silos and hierarchies within our own internal organizations, but also not to stop at the walls and the boundaries of your organization, to use that sense of purpose to actually work across whole systems and value chains. And I think 2015 gave so much of us hope that it was the first time we really saw civic society, government and business all coming together to change the political landscape and the narrative around climate change globally.
That's great. Johan, Eliasch, you are also from the private sector. You are the CEO of Head, a sports equipment company. But you have also a long legacy of engaging in rainforest issues. So you worked in government as well. So you've been really crossing different disciplines, you can say. What is your perspective on accountability? And what role can actually the private sector play? And what should it play?
Well, accountability, in the end, it's all us. It's our planet. We have to protect the planet. The planet can actually survive without us. It's incumbent on us to make sure that the planet can basically deliver what we need in order to sustain ourselves. Now, accountability is also only part of the equation, and that's very important to point out. Because accountability goes with responsibility and authority. So to make people accountable, you need goals, you need to make people responsible, and you need to give institutions or people authority to carry out things. Today, that is blurred, and it has been blurred for a long time. So some responsibilities are vested in the World Bank, others with UNEP, others with UNDP. And these organizations were set up for completely different objectives. And what we need is a world institution that combines all the competences that are required to drive the implementation. Then we can talk about institutional accountability and create an environment where the private sector can be more useful, where we as individuals have more of a scoreboard and drive the process forward.
You say creating one institution. We understand that basically it's not going to be enough to be top down and bottom up. We really have to work together. When you say creating one institution, what are you looking at there? And how should that actually bring together all these different actors?
Well, at this stage in the process, a lot of the issues that we're grappling with are to do with capacity building, as an example. And in places in very corrupt environments, in the environments with poor infrastructure, there is a lot of other things which are not necessarily mapped out in the COP21 agreement, Paris Agreement, that needs to fall in place. And it's very difficult to achieve all this, and we don't have that much time. And it's not only about reducing fossil fuels, which was the sort of big emergency. As an example, one of the speakers brought that up earlier, and that is that food waste accounts for 14% of carbon emissions today, which is frightening if you think about it.
But taking action, I mean, if I look also a little bit, at your history, you have a professional history career, but you have also, which is part of the professional history, of course, invested a lot actively in really trying to protect the rainforest, for instance. So you made, I think that was through the Rainforest Trust, you bought large chunks of land, basically. Is this something you think we need more of? Private investments, even in terms of, for instance, environmental protection and in forests and so on? Or is that just an emergency action because governments are not taking responsibility and are not accountable?
Well, let me say first, I was very romantic when I did this. I don't believe in talk, but action. You do things. So I bought quite a large land area in the Amazonas. And yes, it set the precedent for how to preserve rainforests. What I did was I would give the harvesting rights to fruits and nuts to the indigenous population. So I turned the poachers into custodians.
Okay.
And I can say the deforestation rate has gone down to 0. But in Brazil, and let me go back and say this, the model for rainforest preservation is to make the standing tree much more valuable than the cut-down tree to all stakeholders. And I emphasize all stakeholders. And in Brazil, as we all know, you have very corrupt politicians. And you can't marry rainforest preservation in those areas with corrupt politics. So, yes, this is a formula that works. It can be done by countries. It served as the basis for many things in the RED protocol, which is one of the few things that we got signed up in Copenhagen. So yes, it did a lot of good.
That's great. And I can recommend that you can read the Eliasch review, which actually is partly, pushing the whole RED concept, if I understand correctly. Let me move to Diah Saminarsih. You are from Indonesia, special advisor to the Indonesian Minister of Health. You have an interesting history because you worked already a lot with the MDGs, and now you're moving over to the SDGs, and of course, in particular, health issues. In terms of accountability, if we are looking at a country like Indonesia, does the SDG make any difference for you in that respect? Is there a difference between the MDGs and the SDGs?
Yes, one very fundamental difference is actually public engagement.
Public engagement?
Yes, in the SDG, so much more than in the MDGs. And then my dream is actually, when I look at you engaging the audience and asking who feels accountable, I think my dream will come true if I go to a periphery area of Indonesia, any place in Indonesia, the very remote area, and I ask the public there who is accountable, and everybody raise their hands. I think
it's a self-confident audience.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think I want to see that when we talk about SDGs in Indonesia, because if we don't have the public engaged, then we will not have the SDGs at all.
Yeah. And when you're saying the public is more engaged, how is this changing the relationship between the public and public officials, for instance? Do they feel that they actually need to be more accountable to the public because people are watching them more, or what is the interaction there in a country like Indonesia?
Yeah, I think the dynamics have changed a whole lot. The government is now, I hate to use the word forced, but I think the government have to open up ourselves and listen and really pay attention to what the public has to say.
Yeah.
As far as development, we always say that development is for everyone. Now the SDGs is holding the government accountable whether they can live up to that slogan.
Yes.
Whether development is really for everyone, because it means that the government needs to lend its ears to listen to what the civil society has to say, to open up its eyes on what type of innovations can be replicated to a national scale, or even then help it amplify to a regional scale or a global scale. And also how we engage with the private sector. How we can divide and conquer with the private sector, how resources from the private sector can help leverage the state budget, how it can move the economy, really move the economy of the whole country. I think the SDGs, as it is laid out in the 17 goals and 169 targets, we have enough work to do until 2030. And the fundamental difference is that this time, and the next 15 years, the work will be done really together, not parallel play, but in collaboration.
I will come back to you to a specific question in 1 second, but if I can just ask you, Niall, I mean, what we are hearing here from Indonesia is a perfect example. We have a public which is obviously very much engaged in actually shaping policy, you can say, and driving this complex agenda in a country which is very complex, just geographically very complex, not least. So if you're then representing a telecom industry, what can you actually do to support these kind of bottom-up processes?
Well,
can you find a business out of it?
What was going through my head listening to you talk is actually that the thing that keeps slapping me in the face every time you really get into what's working on the ground, and whether it's fixing policing in the US or whether it's actually people in India be able to hold the regional government to account there, or even just Angela Merkel standing up to Vladimir Putin. Women as leaders at all levels in society are probably one of the single most important interventions we can actually take at every single level. So what can we do? What can we do? We can, as a television company with massive investments in sport, we can look to use big investments in women. And actually, when you see girls in India specifically, in Africa, Latin America, who have self-esteem, self-confidence, that sense of kind of achievement from just heroes, people being motivated by seeing people emerge from their communities who win something, who get recognition, and then they follow. And I think that is an incredibly powerful intervention that a TV channel and a sports TV channel like us can use as part of a more coherent theory of change and getting access to information, and then bringing in shared value solutions on the back of that to scale up, in the background.
That's interesting. But you talked a lot about private-public partnership, and I mean, this is an interesting example that you are describing, where you also can step in and serve that function. But you also had worked something specific called Pansera Nusantara, and that's a platform to really, in the public health sector, but working together with the private sector as well. Can you describe it shortly? What does it mean, and how do you secure accountability in such a platform?
Well, Pansera Nusantara perhaps will be better understood with Healthy Archipelago. It is a pilot, actually. It was a pilot done 3 years ago to transform primary healthcare services in the most periphery area in Indonesia. Now it's been upscaled and replicated nationally into what we call Nusantara Sehat, Healthy Archipelago. It sent teams of health workers, young professionals, health workers, go to periphery areas in locations, remote locations all over Indonesia, and they change the business process management of a public health center.
So that's a very practical example, actually, where you can make a difference by public-private partnership in a very critical area. Lee Howell, Head of Global Programming, member of the Management Board, World Economic Forum. World Economic Forum, it's not a formal intergovernmental process. It's really an engaging platform for companies, politicians, leaders to get together. And you've been around for quite some time. Can you say the issue of accountability and the change in terms of the relationship between, you could say, policy and the private sector? How have you seen that evolving over the years?
Thanks. I think a bit of history. I think for 45 years we were a Swiss non-for-profit foundation. And it was a year ago where we formally changed our status under Swiss law as an international institution that's focused on public-private cooperation. That's significant because in a way, we started, and today we heard quite a bit the term multi-stakeholder.
Yes.
But 40 years ago, 40 plus years ago when we were founded, it was really a very uncommon thought to engage all the stakeholders. It's great today that the norm has shifted and we talk about that. But I think embedded in multi-stakeholders is accountability, but mutual accountability. And I think that's a very different concept. In a way, if we talk about accountability, we're really looking at maybe how we comply with the rules. But I think when we talk about mutual accountability, I think it recognizes explicitly our interdependence and that we're probably part of a community that needs to act together. So we will look at that mutuality, about how we're mutually accountable. To your specific question, what's been interesting for us as an institution is a recognition that initially as a forum, and like a forum here, we wanted to be a place for that multi-stakeholder discussion around shared interests. But you have to evolve, and we're evolving more towards, and you just used the word platform, a model of platform where you can bring together the stakeholders, and they can create the environment for them and enable them to co-design and innovate together. And this is actually on your point a bit about, we have to get to actions. We know that the challenges, some of the SDGs are going to require innovation. In fact, we heard today a lot of the conversation, actually the winner of the Innovation Award, she said something, 3 words that struck me: frustration, then the motivation, then the innovation. And I think we're sufficiently frustrated, and I think we're highly motivated to get to that innovation, but how do you do it when the institutions are siloed, not set up? So maybe the way around it is to create a platform where we let the other apps, so to speak, come on board. So we let the UN agencies that don't normally work together, but we create a space for them so that they can co-develop and actually work together, because at times their mandates are complementary, but also at times they're competitive. And we want to break through that. And of course, today when we speak of multi-stakeholder, we're not talking just business, and we're not talking just government, nor NGOs. We're talking about the citizenry that you described. We can, through the technologies of today, certainly bring, highlight the social entrepreneurship that's embedded in our communities.
But one thing I would like to ask you, because as you said, you've been working with really the top level of the private sector for a very long time. One thing we tend not to discuss very much, for instance, are all the challenges also when we talk about accountability. The fact that if we would only get 1/100th of the tax aversion, back to the system, that equals the global ODA. So, and we have huge challenges still with corruption. We have, it's a broad range of issues which are linked to trade and so many. How are you discussing also these issues in the World Economic Forum? Or is it a cozy club where you sort of...
No, absolutely. I mean, we have an initiative on corruption. My background is in public service. I think the difference today is that, it was great that we had the speaker here saying what a historic achievement it was to get all these countries together to sign and sign on to the SDGs. Those sorts of solutions are really historic in the sense that quite rare. Most of the time, I think we have to find within our community those who share an interest, who actually share, and with that interest will engage in some purpose to address that interest and get to action. And I think the key in all of this is really seeking out within the communities the few that are willing to step up. You're not going to get everybody, but it's sort of, it's the Pareto principle. You can get 20% to engage to focus on 80% of the problem. And so this is where I think the key is not to go out and try to get everybody on board, but have conversations that say those who are really committed, frustrated enough, motivated enough to want to innovate, give them the space and let them solve and work together. And I think we have to do more of that. I think this is a great place to start with the issues that very much concern us today.
That's great. So you see that development. If I go to you, Dr. Sania Nishtar, president and founder of Heartfile, a very astonishing work that you've done in Pakistan, which of course, again, it's a country with great challenges, and you've really been able to drive changes in terms of health reforms, health policy, and so on. But you actually responded when I sent out an email to you with a very interesting question that you felt would be interesting to discuss. The misperceptions about accountability. Of course, in a session about accountability, now we've heard these four talking about it, and then I turn to you for the final panelist here. What are the misconceptions that you mean we have about accountability?
Well, I think before we go on to the misconceptions, we are at the end of this panel, this whole session on accountability, and I think it needs to be recognized that accountability is a central thread in governance. And many of the problems that we see in the public and private worlds are largely because institutions and organizations have either inadvertently or consciously failed to institutionalize accountability within governance systems. So coming to the misconceptions, there are some very salient misconceptions about accountability. One of them relates to the fact that it is always perceived as something very punitive, whereas accountability has a preventive and corrective function as well, so that as you formulate policies and as you cascade them into implementation, you're able to sift out where the issues are, and you can course correct as you go along. Secondly, in terms of the misconceptions, at least in some parts of the world, accountability is thought of as an exploitative tool, whereas accountability is about building systems and delivering results, and about implementation effectiveness, and about value for money creation. Because we all know that good governance is a major driver of economic growth and development. But then good governance is determined by accountability, and it also comprises accountability. So we need to look at accountability from that systems lens within that governance context. Also, a lot of times we think that accountability is a one-time happening which comes into play in response to a wrongdoing, whereas accountability is something that needs to be institutionalized in governance processes. And in all the evidence policy and implementation circles, and that by itself is quite a science on its own, because you have to look at where the actors are, what the relationship between the actors are, who's accountable to who. So if you look at the public policy realm, if you take it as a case example, you've got legislators, you've got actors who formulate policies, those who implement them, who deliver services, their consumers that are the beneficiaries. There are monitoring and review mechanisms. Well, they're supposed to be there. And there are explicit accountability relationships all across this monitor, review, and enact cycle. And actually, another misperception is that this is something that happens automatically. It is not. It actually, there's a huge interplay of some conscious decisions that governments take.
Could you, just to give a practical example, you have been driving the reform in Pakistan, for instance, in terms of health. What was the sort of key pushers that you could use to really get something like that through in the system that you have?
I think the first thing is that you have to lead by example. So when I was a cabinet minister, I decided, the first question I asked was that what are my accountabilities? Who am I accountable to, and how do I? Because I also run an NGO, so where is the firewall? And because I thought that accountability paradigm was not clearly defined, I decided to make all my decisions public, and I published a set of handover papers and put them out in the public domain.
So it's really working very systematically.
It's working systematically. It's about making sure that the data systems are there, making sure that they are independent and neutral and impartial. It's making sure that there is capacity at the country level to ensure that data is translated into evidence. It's about ensuring that there are institutional arrangements in place to hold decision makers accountable, to conform their decisions with evidence. And of course, it is also about having accountabilities for the right reasons. Because a lot of times the accountability frameworks are there, but if there is a culture of political allegiances within that country, then the accountability will work for a very wrong purpose. And I circle back to the very profound statement that you made, a fellow panelist made about turning poachers into guardians. So it's about changing incentive systems. So data, institutional arrangements, the evidence policy cycle, the right incentives, in an overall environment of transparency, in an overall environment where collusion is not the name of the game, will actually augur well for accountability.
So Sania, what you're describing sounds like basically it's hard work.
It is, but
there's no easy way out.
It has to be conscious, and there has to be a conscious, concerted effort to put it in place.
Unfortunately, they took 3 minutes out of my panel, which means that time is out. But, Femi, I have to ask just one, and she promised to keep it in 20 seconds, the response there, because it's so important. Because, Sania, you sent me also, why don't you ask me why I stepped down from the UN Secretary General Independent Accountability Panel? And you were actually appointed chair in February. And, when I got that email, I started to look on the web because I felt like I'm going to find really a nasty story here about things. But I didn't find anything. But actually, it's maybe some good news coming out of that.
Well, actually, earlier this year, I was appointed by the UN Secretary General to chair the Independent Accountability Panel, which is mandated to come out with an annual report about the status of women, children, and adolescents' health, and to independently and impartially point out the weaknesses and then come up with remedial actions. And I was very honored to have been asked to chair that. But subsequent to the announcement of my candidacy for WHO Director General by my government, I have decided to step down because IAP is meant to be independent and impartial. And in order for it to be effective, it is important that there should be neither any real nor any perceived conflict of interest. And therefore, in order to safeguard the work of the IAP, I decided to step down. But I also wanted to signal my respect for this very important institutional attribute of governance.
Thank you very much. And Gunhild, we started off actually this panel by asking people how many felt accountable in here, and they all raised their hands for some reason, So I'm going to ask you to raise your hand. How many want to see Sania for next WHO head? Yes, come on, yes. So you see, you have the full support here, no question about it. Amazing panel. I'm sorry about the short time. 5 such extraordinary people. The only critique for this conference is that you can't give me 5 such people and give me 27 minutes. That's not accountable. Okay, so thank you very much, and a warm applause.